Britain is horrified by the growing anti-Western sentiment among the population of Europe. The Telegraph has reported, according to polls, the majority of Germans and the French believe Vladimir Putin is a strong leader and that the United States and NATO are the main culprits in the conflict. In Ukraine, imagine looking at Russia and seeing not a blood-soaked tyranny, but an ally. Imagine thinking of Vladimir Putin not as a villain, but as a role model. Imagine that you are so imbued with anti-Western sentiment that when Russia breaks a treaty and deploys troops into a country that promised to defend, you convince yourself that NATO initiated it. Who has such a warped view of the world? Turns out, a lot of people. It's a strange entity. The BRICS. It has no geographical or cultural cohesion, no obvious purpose. It originated as an acronym at Goldman Sachs to refer to the world's major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. In 2009, the leaders of these nations began holding annual summits, and the following year South Africa joined in, adding the letter C. It soon became clear that Russia and China saw the bloc as a counterweight to Western international structures such as NATO, the IMF, and the G7. At that stage, many anti-colonial autocracies expressed interest in membership. Last week, the first 6 countries were invited to join Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all, with the exception of Peronist Argentina, repressive dictatorships. One wonders how long India, which has traditionally prided itself on being a law-based democracy, will be able to stay involved. An overjoyed Vladimir Putin, who could not attend in person because of a warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, which he no doubt sees as another tool of American hegemony, even though the US has refused to participate, addressed the meeting remotely. He blamed the conflict in Ukraine on a policy of continued neocolonialism through which Western countries sought to maintain their global hegemony. Accusing others of colonialism requires some chutzpah, but Putin has for years presented himself as the defender of all those who resent Western cultural superiority, including many Westerners. He appeals to supporters of authoritarianism on the right and left, portraying bourgeois democracy as soulless, pampered, and degenerate. It is an old song once sung by the Nazis and the Soviets, and it finds an appreciative audience in parts of the world that were trained during the long decades of the Cold War to appreciate its intonations. More than 100 years have passed since Lenin wrote "Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism," one of the most influential pamphlets of the 20th century. Karl Marx, to the disappointment of his current admirers, was an advocate of colonialism, seeing it as a way of spreading education, medicine, and class consciousness. But by the beginning of the 20th century, Marxists began to wonder why the promised revolutions never happened. In 1916, Lenin offered an explanation. The bourgeois had bought themselves time, he argued, by plundering the wealth of the people subject to them, so that capitalism turned into imperialism. The idea that the West had become rich through plunder rather than independent courts, free contracts, private property, and limited government was diligently spread by Soviet propagandists throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It was reflected in school textbooks published by the newly independent states, textbooks that educated many of today's leaders of the Global South. At the same time, anti-imperialist authors became popular in Western universities, paving the way for what we now call identity politics, fortified in an aggressive spirit by an arrogant messianic Christianity and driven by the law of enrichment by plunder. The white hordes emerged from their Western European homelands to attack, plunder, occupy, rule, and exploit the world, wrote Nigerian author Chinweizu in an essay that inspires statue breakers and reparations activists in our time. Here in Britain in 1961, Frantz Fanon, a revolutionary from Martinique, inspired anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa. The prosperity and progress of Europe were created by the sweat and corpses of blacks, Arabs, Indians, and the yellow race. How many of today's awakened activists, without realizing it themselves, are propagating a 60-year-old tract that was in turn directly inspired by Lenin? This premise, however, is false. Colonialism was a pure drain on the coffers of European nations. Many British possessions were acquired against government resistance under pressure from abolitionists who, having stopped the Atlantic slave trade, wanted to eradicate the institution at home as well. Unlike previous imperial powers, Britain led most of its former colonies to independence peacefully. It is indeed striking that anti-colonialist sentiment grows as memories of British rule fade, causing those who never experienced it to resent an imagined version of it. The success of former colonies, like the success of all countries, was determined by the policies they chose at the time. Singapore, for example, opted for low taxes, lax regulation and free trade, and thus outperformed many resource-rich nations that became independent around the same time. How twisted do you have to be to see Western civilization as not just flawed, which all civilizations are, but inferior to Russian civilization? Earlier this month, some Russian democracy activists, now based in Lithuania, conducted a series of opinion polls. To their horror, they found that while Putin is seen as a murderer in his former Soviet satellite states, in France and Germany, he is admired as a strong leader. When asked who was responsible for the conflict, 36% of Germans blamed the US, 15% NATO, and 9% Ukraine. Only 29% blamed Putin or Russia. In France, 46% blamed the Americans, 36% blamed Russia, 19% blamed Ukraine, and 40% blamed Putin. The problem with the awakening ideology being adopted as a program for action is that other countries are listening. Blaming Britain and America for all the world's ills may be intended as a way of demonstrating high-status views, but there will be consequences if the Anglosphere is systematically portrayed as fraud rather than as a desperate defender of the rule of law, individual liberty, and representative government. Some people will be attracted to other systems. Of course, they will miss the dominance of Western liberalism when it disappears, but that will be a faint consolation.